I have some things to say regarding Roger Scruton's connection with Brazil, but let me start with my personal story. I had the good fortune to meet Roger Scruton for the first time at the Cosmos Club, not far from here down Massachusetts Avenue, in 2006. This first encounter was followed by other meetings and correspondences that allow us to get better acquainted. I need not mention the privilege that it was for me to have these exchanges with Roger Scruton. I still have vivid memories of his insights on music, literature, architecture, and of course, philosophy, and a variety of other subjects. His company was always a source of intellectual excitement for me. I, in turn, would often bring up Brazil in our conversations. To my satisfaction, I found Roger Scruton most curious about my country, its historical evolution, cultural heritage, and current events. Over the years and throughout the time of our acquaintance, Roger Scruton began to develop an avid following in Brazil. This growing interest in his work generated a demand for his books, many of which were translated into Portuguese. Actually, there are now about 20 of his titles in print in Brazil. Of the over 50 he left us. Roger Scruton, with pleasant surprise, once asked me why he was so popular in Brazil, among students in particular. I answered that Olavo de Carvalho, a prominent Brazilian philosopher and educator, had recommended his writings, especially Thinkers of the New Left, a book all but banished from certain circles, including in this country. Many of my American friends have already heard of Olavo de Carvalho, a close friend of mine who for many years lived in Virginia until his death this past January. I think January is the cruelest month, I should correct Elliot. With an increasing number of readers in Brazil eager to meet Roger Scruton, invitations were extended for the great thinker to visit Brazil. He told me in one of our conversations of his desire to take up an invitation and go, but confessed that he was no longer a young lad to endure the long flight from England to Brazil. Finally, in July 2019, to the joy of his Brazilian admirers, Sir Roger agreed to travel to my country, to São Paulo, where he would give a series of lectures. While in São Paulo, he entered his first impressions of Brazil into his journal. Alone in a hotel room with a volume of Shakespeare, he looked down from his window upon the teeming streets below. With his penetrating insight, he wrote that Brazil was, and I quote him directly, Western civilization in the furthest point it has reached, end quote. Soon after his return to London, he was diagnosed with a virulent cancer that would take his life on January 12, 2020. I like to think that if Roger Scruton were still here with us, he would continue to strengthen these bonds with Brazil. In celebration of the memory of Sir Roger Scruton and of his bonds with Brazil and the United States, we are proud to host this special evening of conversation. I thank you all and look forward for a great discussion. Thank you.
A little bit shorter here. Thank you, Ambassador. Good evening, everyone. My name is Fisher Derderian, and I am the Executive Director of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation. It's a pleasure to be with you here tonight as we reflect upon the legacy of Sir Roger Scruton and what his work meant to a great many people. We are honored to be joined by many esteemed guests this evening, as the Ambassador noted. First and foremost, of course, the Brazilian Ambassador to the United States, Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl Sears of Virginia, and Lord Frost. Thank you for all coming. I also want to take a minute to thank our host committee for the evening, the Ambassador, Devin Hill, Byron Carlock, Al Regnery, and George C., who could not be here tonight. Without your generous support, this event would not be possible. The Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation was born out of a conversation I had with Sir Roger 3 years ago, back in 2018. Or is it 4 years now? 4 years now, excuse me. I was a student of his at the time and got into conversations with him about his future plans, especially as it regarded the United States. I had boldly suggested that we create an institution that could further his work with projects that would capture Roger in his proper environment bring more students to him at his farm, which he was very excited about, and allow for new opportunities. Though Roger had signed off on our plans and given me his blessings to move forward, we sadly didn't get to pursue them together. As the ambassador noted, he passed away in January 2020 at the age of 75, leaving us at a great pause. Instead, our plans developed into an institution devoted to his legacy and fighting for the great inheritance to which he had devoted his life. Alongside his widow, Lady Scruton, and our founding board, we launched the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation in August 2020 to a resounding success and international reception. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work has been to uncover, as tonight proves, the many people around the world who, like me, have been formed and shaped by their encounters with Roger as a friend, as a student, and as an admirer. As we'll explore further tonight, Scruton's work is so universal due to his rigorous and beautiful defense of humane culture and wisdom. He is the rare example of a philosopher and public intellectual who, even amidst sustained attacks and attempts to tarnish his name, could look around him to find so many things he loved and was grateful for, and endeavor to instill that same love in anyone who is willing to engage with him. He is an inspiring model of how one can fully love his community, his culture, and his traditions, and how you can support others to do the same. This, I believe, is why we have the unique privilege tonight of a Brazilian statesman hosting an American foundation to honor the legacy of a great Englishman. At a time when society is so quick and willing to repudiate that which we have inherited, it is imperative to recognize the beauty and courage in the traditions of the West. Thus, in all of our endeavors, we aim to extend Scruton's legacy by creating a network of those who, like Roger, are cultivating a culture of gratitude, inspired by a love of their own traditions. We grow this network through programs like the Roger Scruton Memorial Lectures in Oxford, the Nostos Conference in Norway, book clubs, and more. So with that, I want to turn it over to our panel for the evening. It's now my pleasure to introduce Daniel McCarthy, our moderator for tonight. Dan is the Vice President of ISI's Collegiate Network and the editor of their magazine, Modern Age. Dan, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Fisher. And let me also express my deep gratitude to the ambassador for hosting us tonight, and indeed to all of you for coming. We have a superb panel of people who knew Roger Scruton, who knew his thought, and who apply his ethos and spirit to the world of politics, the world of journalism, the world of high culture as well. Douglas Murray is someone who you've read in many publications, in The Spectator, in Unheard, and other outlets. He is the author of such important books as The Strange Death of Europe, and most recently, The Madness of Crowds. Andrew Balio is the principal trumpet for the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra and is the founder of the Future Symphony Institute, with which I know Roger Scruton was involved at the very beginning and helping to launch that. Gentlemen, I thought we would begin by bouncing off a point the ambassador raised, that Roger Scruton saw Brazil as the sort of furthest reach of Western civilization. And while Brazil has, as the United States does, deep roots in the Old World, deep roots in European civilization, Brazil is also, perhaps even more so than the United States, a nation of the future, a place that people often point to as the sort of leading index of the 21st century. I wanted to ask both of you, what are your thoughts of what Roger Scruton's message would entail for a country such as Brazil, which has such an enormously promising future, such tremendous growth, but also faces many difficulties and dangers as Western civilization itself perhaps starts to lose confidence in itself. What would Roger Scruton advise a state like Brazil today to take as its sort of cultural and maybe political direction? Perhaps I'll start with Andrew, because I know you've spent extensive time in Brazil with various orchestra projects.
Thank you so much. It's such a wonderful honor to be in conversation with both of you. I just read Douglas's book of the War Against the West, which is a tremendous book. I've amassed so many books on this whole issue, starting with Spengler, going forward. And I just find Douglas's latest work one that it allows me to put the other books aside and just focus on his book. In my, I think in our roles here today is that Douglas represents the macrocosm, an incredible viewpoint on what in the world is happening to our civilization. And I represent the microcosm, because I'm simply a musician. I'm glad you introduced me primarily as a trumpet player, and a trumpet player who started a research institute with Roger Scruton and architect Leon Creer to find a way to, first of all, craft a philosophy for that classical music could latch onto that could help us explain what's so important to us as musicians and want to help defend ourselves against onslaughts. So what I think happened with Brazil and Roger was that many Brazilians saw in Roger's writings themselves. Roger had an incredible ability to speak, to write and speak in such a way that he made us feel like he was speaking for us. And even it didn't matter left or right. It wasn't about that, but it was he really brought things home to people. And I think that from my experience with Brazilians, many of them could really find what Roger was saying something that was very, very relevant to what was going on, these false dichotomies of right and left, and really simply wanting to have a sense of home and belongingness with each other, and that what concerned most people was local politics, local issues, and I think that was those were philosophical ideas that he brought forth so beautifully, and certainly he, in my microcosm, he certainly defined what was so unique and important about classical music and what set it apart from other kinds of music. And Brazil is a place that has so many kinds of music that coexist and mingle and mix that are so, in such a remarkable way. And I think Roger was great at pointing out to Brazilians what was wonderful about their place.
Marvelous.
Just add to that, also it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you once again to the ambassador. I wouldn't dare to suggest what Roger would say about any political project, not least because he was very careful about making interventions in practical politics, as it were. I think one of the reasons why his legacy is so strong already is partly that that what he had to say isn't limited by any one country, isn't limited by date, because he was able to speak at a strata below the one of everyday politics in a way. That's one of the reasons why I think so many people are attracted to him, that there are many people who talk about, let's say, the surface level of politics, but they want to go towards deeper things. And actually Roger's a very unusual figure in not only being able to write about politics with great clarity, but also writing about those deeper things. Shortly after his death, there was a conference, a conservative conference in Rome, Chris Muth, among others, was involved with. And I was stunned sitting in the audience. We only just lost Roger, and I was stunned, very moved by the fact that people from a bewildering number of countries who spoke, all citing Roger. There were. It's not common, I mean, even for a French person to quote an English philosopher. So hearing not only the French, but everybody else all citing this as well, it brought to mind something which I remember Roger had said to me once in Sweden. We were together there to speak at a conference some years ago, and I remember him saying very clearly that when I sort of said something, we sort of got to Stockholm and drove for hours to get to somewhere in the middle of the country where we found various glass and steel monstrosities. And they didn't go down very well with Roger, I remember, who said at one point, he said, "That building has been built entirely to tell you, you do not matter." But I remember we were talking about Sweden, and like all societies, when you go into them, you try to work something out, which is the nature of the society. What are the deep things in the society? What are the tectonic plates of the society? And it's hard sometimes from outside. It's often very hard to work out what they are. But Roger, I remember on that occasion, made a very important insight, which is that, as he said then, he said, of course, the left always have an advantage over the right in one way, which is that the left can always say, these are the things we're going to do. And wherever you go in the world, you pretty much find the same things. You know, it might be equity, it might be justice, it might be vague terms, it might be specific things. But they seem always to be in lockstep. And I remember Roger saying this is a great advantage that the left have, because by comparison, conservatives are always conserving something different. You know, and I remember he said, you know, here in Sweden, they are conserving something different from what we're conserving in Britain. People in England are conserving something slightly different from people in Scotland or Wales, and on. And I always was struck by this insight because, of course, in one way it looks like a tactical advantage of the left. On the other hand, it really isn't. It's a wonderful thing once you step back and realize that all these societies are preserving their own rich heritage and their own rich ideas, and you can give a nudge into things that you might think that they should do. But really the most important thing, which I think Roger very often said, was to conserve and preserve the things in your society that are good, you know, and to be grateful for the riches of it. Which is a very broad but a very rarely uttered phrase, you know, particularly in an era where people say, this is a thing I want, you know, I'm owed these things. Actually, that whole thing of gratitude, which Fisher just mentioned in his opening remarks, is a deep, deep insight, which needs to be dwelt upon, particularly today.
And on the theme of gratitude, I'd like to ask both of you to talk about your own encounters with Roger Scruton, how you first came across his work, perhaps, and how his influence, his work, but also his example, influenced your own trajectory in life.
Well, I first met him when I left university, and I'd written my first book already, and I'd got some money for it, and of course I'd spent it because I was 20, and of course, at the age of 20, if you make any money, you think that'll keep happening, and I probably won't. I was amazed to discover that the money ran out, and so I had to start work again, and I knew I wanted to write about politics, among other things, and I was gently directed towards an online publication in London, which claimed to be, and I was an intern, and at first I was an intern for free, and made the coffee and all that sort of thing, and was allowed to write as well, which was a very useful experience. And then I was paid the grand sum of £50 a week, which I have to say felt like absolute manna from heaven. But yes, and it was meant to be left and right, taking each other on equal terms, but also not doing frivolous attacks or anything like that, but really taking each other's arguments seriously. Well, of course, that didn't happen. And I discovered that almost everybody was a very, very fervent left-winger. And there was one exception, which was that Roger Scruton was involved. And he would very occasionally appear in the office. His wife, Sophie, was also involved. And Roger would very occasionally appear in the office and would be reading a book, you know, which nobody else was doing. You know, everyone else was sitting at their screens, typing furiously. And I think he spotted that we might have some similar views, you know, and we sort of got to know each other a bit. And then at some point, he said to me, well, Douglas, I imagine that you've now worked out what's really going on here. And I said, I'm getting there. And he said, you've probably worked out it's not, well, he said, it's about 50,000 leftists versus us. And he said, so it's a fair fight. And we really became friends from there, and he made a huge impact on me. But of course, and something, I mean, he's made an enormous impact on my thought, such as it is, and my attitudes towards a whole range of things. But in a way, of course, it's worth noticing that for me, one of the great important things was he was also deeply practical in his advice. You know, and as many of you will know, when you're starting off, you know, you don't really need somebody to explain to you, you know, a theory of metaphysics. I mean, you do, but you also need to keep the wolf from the door and pay the bills. And Roger really understood that, and it would sort of point me towards things. Well, you know, if you do this, then you could do that, but also on the side write a book and pretend it's the advance, and then from that you could have another book, you see. And there's sort of very practical advice, and almost nobody does that in your life. You always hope that there are figures who are going to do that in your life, but almost nobody does. And he was like that with so many people, and the more I got to know him, the more I would discover that he just did that sort of thing all the time. We were once in Belgium or somewhere for a conference, and I discovered he'd come in the night before to see a student. And I said, well, how long has this student been a student of yours? He said, he isn't. And I said, well, how do you know him? He said, I didn't. This student had written to Roger out of the blue sometime before, and it said it was obviously in some deep turmoil about things and wasn't sure how his life was going and all this sort of thing. And Roger had come early to meet a person he didn't know in order to help them for free. And it was things like that that just, quite often people, particularly if they have there's a rule sometimes in public life that people who have a very friendly public profile are not like that really. And the opposite is also the case. Very often people who are thought of as rather austere turn out to be the most generous, the most kindly, and Roger absolutely fitted that. He was enormous encouragement to me.
Andrew, did you find likewise?
Absolutely. That's such a wonderful story that you tell. Roger had an incredible, if we look back at his life, we will see all of these people that he adopted, people that he would take in or go to champion. He would fly off to Hungary or Czechoslovakia and to see how he could help out. He would just, and that was very much my experience. His first question when I first met him was, how can he help? He wanted to help. And I couldn't believe it. This guy wanted to help. I hadn't met many people who wanted to help. And just to back up a little, the way I found him was very similar to what you were describing, is that I had been amassing way too many books in my home on all these different subjects that I thought could help describe all the problems that the classical music world was facing. It was a political onslaught, but there was all these other issues going on, and of course, we needed a philosophy. So I had a minor, stumbling as a teenager into the world of philosophy that I was trying to build upon, and within all these books that I had, I found that all the ones I liked were by Roger Scruton. Whether it was about philosophy itself or music or conservationism, which I thought, the world of, defending the environment had some application towards our plight. Even wine, because we always notice that the same people who are drinking all the wine are also going to the classical music concerts. And why is that? And at one point I said, wait a minute, it's the same guy. So I found a way to contact him, and he wrote back to me quite quickly and more or less said, how could he help? And so I thought, my goodness, I would love to meet you and talk about this. And he said, well, I'm coming to Washington, D.C. next month. Perhaps we could meet then. And I thought, wait a minute. One thing I know about this guy is he loves wine. So I invited him to a very fancy restaurant in Georgetown, and I made sure there was going to be really great wine. They're thinking I was going to have to ply him with wine in order to get him to work with me. And really, I would say the entire conversation consisted of him asking how he could help. So he was very much always looking out for these little platoons that Burke talks about, these small groups, these small initiatives. And I think he saw in our what I was trying to build, this Future Symphony Institute, was something that could actually sort of champion what he had already said about music and all of these other things that we could, in a sense, carry his torch for him. And most certainly, what I felt about Roger was that here is a man who is speaking for us, the classical musicians and the people who love classical music, describing so perfectly what's going on. Because that was the thing that I was struck by. I spent so much of my adult life as a professional musician playing around the world, and it was only when I came back, in my mid-30s to the United States when I had a job here, and I was asking myself, what in the world is going on here? It was as if the classical music world was trying to destroy itself, and I realized after some time that it was academia that had led the way in trying to undo all of its greatest accomplishments. Everything that was great about academia was trying to tear down. And it was only Roger who put it so well for me. Maybe there were other writers who were talking about this earlier on, but it was Roger who reached me, because that was what's so wonderful about him, is he could put himself in our shoes, whoever we are. Of course he could speak philosopher with the best living philosophers, but he really wanted to write for regular folks. And that was, I think that's something so wonderful about him. It's philosophy that was not watered down or dumbed down, yet was comprehensible to people who wanted to understand these things. And I think that's the mark of a really great writer, is one who doesn't hide, doesn't obfuscate behind complexity, but makes their arguments utterly very crystal clear. And so I really see myself in what had happened with you, that he discovered you and nurtured you, and made himself available to you. And that was very much my experience. I was simply a trumpet player who was wanting to help my own little corner of the world, and he dove in head first.
Something surprising about Roger Scruton that perhaps most people would not expect or would not anticipate. Were there facets of his character? Obviously, this was a Renaissance man we're talking about, someone whose interests and areas of expertise were absolutely staggering. But were there things that you encountered in knowing him that surprised you a great deal and that led you to see, there's even a dimension here that I had not anticipated from reading his work and from the public persona, perhaps, that Roger Scruton had?
Yes, I mean, he was very, other people here who knew him know, he was a very surprising person all the time. I think at first it sometimes took a while to break through the initial. He definitely had a certain mask up sometimes to the world, because the world had been quite unkind to him for a long time, and people who have experienced that can develop a sort of veneer to protect themselves. And there was that sometimes, but once he realized he was so safe, or in a amicable environment, that dropped. And of course, he was. I mean, among his many other achievements, he was a brilliant bomb thrower. I mean, he in private conversation, as in some of his public articles, he would always sort of put in one. Somebody said one really tightly packed pipe bomb, and the reader wouldn't know it had gone off until after they'd gone past it. And he was the same. I remember he once hilariously in a speech just referred in passing, because somebody had said something about optimism in a speech at the same event. He just referred in passing to the appalling damage done by optimists. And it took a while for everyone to realize what had just been said. And he sort of did that sort of thing all the time. And you could see he had a certain delight in it. And he liked being slightly naughty in a way, saying things that he knew exactly caused a sort of little bit of electricity to spark in the room. But of course, it was a brilliant thing as a writer, because as a writer, you need to keep readers going. And if you can throw in the odd firework, it helps. And even in some of his most sort of perhaps off-putting books in a way, or ones that might seem off-putting, you discover the moment you open them that you're in very, very skilled hands, just as a writer, never mind as a philosopher. I mean, I think it's in the history of philosophy that in passing, he summarizes Sartre's thought in 1.5 pages, which nobody else could do. And then just in passing mentions that when Sartre died, somebody said that the great sadness now is that in Paris you would go to cafes on the left bank and you'd know that you wouldn't see Sartre. And Roger said in passing, on the contrary, I think one of the great pleasures of life is knowing you can go into any cafe in Paris and not encounter Sartre. And only he would have done that. And but his ability to sum things up was quite unbelievable. I mean, I've never known anybody else come close. You could be sitting around a dinner table with somebody, with a banker or somebody, and somebody would start talking about economic theory, and then you'd have this terrible moment of, oh God, Roger, you can do this as well, you know. And somebody did say once, well, what's that theory of? And they mentioned an incredibly complex monetary theory thing. And Roger said, oh, well, there are two views on this, and then laid out the history of this particular thing. And it was just one of those times when you sort of, everyone else felt that they might want to give up, but he didn't do it ostentatiously at all. You just kept discovering things he knew, which I never forget. So there's one other example of that. Some years ago, he'd written The West and the Rest, and a few years later, I remember a group of us were at dinner in London with a great late Persian friend of Roger's mine called Shusha Guppy, a wonderful writer. And somebody said, there was sort of various hacks and writers around, and somebody said in passing to Roger, are you thinking of doing an updated version of The West and the Rest? And he said, I would, but I don't think my Arabic's up to it anymore. And every other writer in the room just looked sick, but he wasn't showing off. It was just, you just endlessly found these extraordinary things that he knew. And just amazing.
Now, Andrew, I know you presented some surprises to Roger himself, including a question that he did not anticipate one time about heavy metal music. What were some of the dimensions of Roger's character that you found surprising or unexpected?
Oh, well, first of all, I was reminded while you were speaking, do you remember how the BBC television would haul out Roger to be the conservative punching bags? It would be, two liberals and then Roger to give the other side. And he had such an incredible economy with his rebuttals and responses. Yes. I mean, they would take up so much more time. They would just go on, and he'd say something like, well, I suppose that's good if you like that sort of thing.
Yes.
And it was so funny.
He once with Terry Eagleton, he did a conversation with Terry Eagleton, the Marxist lecturer from Manchester University. And I remember Terry Eagleton, this long disquisition. And Roger said, let us pretend for a moment that what you say is true.
Exactly.
You just seen an assassination.
Yes. Well, there was some smarty pants youngster, college student who asked a very impertinent question in one of his college lectures. He said, well, first of all, one reason is I'm a lot smarter than you are.
Oh gosh!
And he really just put this kid, put him in his place on that one. But to your question, first of all, I mean, just in the world of music and musicians, Roger explained music to musicians. Now that's a really hard thing to do. His books are read by some extremely accomplished musicians, and whereas they may quibble with what he was citing, Roger was not a musician per se. He taught himself piano, and he actually wrote operas of all things, which takes enormous courage to do that. But he put himself out. He somehow found time to write operas and wrote other small chamber works. And these are legitimate pieces of music, and then he wrote insights into the inner workings of music, of how it functions inside in a way that it actually makes sense. It was metaphoric because it's such a hard subject to get into, but as a philosopher that he took on aesthetics. After so many decades of philosophers just sitting out that one, just leaving aesthetics aside, and he took on music and said, well, let's take apart music and look at it. How does it actually work, and why is there an empirical truth to why harmony actually has a certain push and pull to it, and it's not simply arbitrary music. We're not simply conditioned animals that just like music because we were conditioned that way. So that was really the big elephant in the room with aesthetics since since World War II, which was it's all arbitrary and it's all everything's just your opinion. He said, well, no, actually it's not, and there's a reason why a certain kind of music works and another kind of music works even better, and why. And he dove into very dangerous territory. He did it adeptly, and that really surprised not only me, but a lot of people. So who is this guy? He's not one of us. He's not an insider to the music establishment. And yet he dove in, and then he dove out because he had other things to do. And I think that makes him a genuine polymath. The polymath is a real rarity nowadays in an age of specialization.
We've been convened by the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation, and in order to perpetuate his legacy, I think we have to have an ability to find new disciples for Roger Scruton and promote his work to another generation. I'm curious, where would you begin with that task? What books or what ideas would you present to someone who had never heard of Roger Scruton, had never encountered him before, and say, this is where you should begin, and this will lead you on to the sort of depth and excitement and riches of Roger's thought?
Gosh, I have to be careful what I say about this because I keep recommending certain books of Roger's, and then the price of them online goes shooting up. There's a book I've been recommending for ages on hunting, which has been out of print for 20 years. I'm trying to get several publishers now saying they might do it, but trying to get it put back into print because the cheapest copy online is $499. I know. I was thinking of selling my copy, but
Jeff Bezos doesn't want you hunting.
No, absolutely. But I mean, I mention that because it's just an incredibly charming, very, very readable account of. It's not really about hunting; it's about finding love and actually finding his love with Sophia. And he talks about Heidegger. I mean, it's incredible, an extraordinary book that you don't realize until after you've finished it just how much you've just got. But there are lots of books. There's one that's just been reissued. I did a new forward to try to give it another life, called Confessions of a Heretic. That's brought out by the beautiful Notting Hill editions, and that's an amazing selection of essays, and that's a very good place to start, because there's writing on the nation state, writing on aesthetics. One of his terrific essays on the nature of kitsch, which is just something he mastered. I mean, nobody else has ever managed to just. I'm surprised Jeff Koons has survived Roger's writing on him. But I also mentioned because there's that aspect of Roger, which is clearly one of the things that make people want to come to him and make them want to stay, which is, I think, this very, very important thing in his whole worldview, which was that. Politics mattered and a lot. You couldn't be a hermit. You couldn't cut yourself off from political affairs, nor should you, nor should conservatives. But that in music, and it may be in music in particular, we've been given something that's so important we have to linger over it for more than a moment. And there's an essay in Confessions of a Heretic called "Effing the Ineffable" about. And it's just 3 pages, and I keep saying to people, I would start there, because in 3 pages he explains something extraordinarily deep and important, which every human being on earth could recognize something. He says, throughout our lives we get these moments where it feels as if we've been given a moment of transcendence. We've been able to glimpse something, and he says something like, on the winding, ill-lit staircase of our lives, we get these glimpses as if around a corner. And that music in particular gives us this. In his documentary, Beauty, that he made for the BBC, amazingly, and a book on that OUP published, he said something similar. Remember, it's now pirated online. I think the only version that was online was one with Portuguese subtitles. But he says in this, he had to arranges a performance of Pergolesi's Stabat Mater in King's Cross Station in London, and it was a wonderful thing because of course all of these commuters all rushing to the Eurostar and things suddenly stop because there's James Bowman and I think Emma Kirkby singing Pergolesi's Stabat Mater, and of course you stop, and it was a sort of visual thing of something he was always trying to put his finger on. And he says in Effing the Ineffable that it is a sort of impossible task to put your finger on it. But nevertheless, we should try to identify what this thing is that music is saying to us. There's Schopenhauer, doesn't he? He says music speaks to us of itself. And so perhaps more than any of the other arts, it matters because we're even closer to this sense than we might be from other arts, that it's speaks to us in the very language we're trying to learn to speak, or that we dream in, or it's something like that. And that having been gifted this thing, we should recognize that it's probably telling us something else as well, that it's giving us a glimpse through into something else that we know but can't reach, and intuit to be the thing. And that music is perhaps the best means we have to try to understand that thing which we know we can be, or sense we are. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, because I think you touched on my favorite book. If I were to pick one book of Roger's, that would be The Doorway, which I think would be most welcoming, and the one where someone who's new to Roger and wanted to get what he was really trying to say with his life, which I would say the book Beauty, because in that book, everything he describes are things that we've all experienced, walking down the street or walking into a museum and not getting it when there's some painting that just makes no sense to us, and why beauty actually matters. And for him, that was the ultimate calculus that had to be run on anything, which was, is what we're doing beautiful? Is this going to be ultimately beautiful? And there's two books, which are actually my favorite books, that culminate in the final chapters. He uses music to make his last final argument about that he's building up, and this is The Face of God and Soul of the World. And both of those books, he says, he writes so beautifully on trying to, in the face of God, which is this, well, I won't even attempt to try to explain it, but he, when he's exhausted everything else, he makes musical examples that a person can both, if you can't recall, you can easily go online and listen to these works. And he says that work at this moment describes what I'm trying to say here, and that I don't know that a philosopher's ever done that before, and that's why he's, those were all the roads that kept leading to Rome, which is leading back to beauty, leading back to music, to be illustrative. And music for him was the most illustrative art because it's formless and it's ineffable. And yet we all get music at some level, and it's something that maybe we haven't all contemplated, is why is music so powerful for us when instead we can't even put our fingers on it? What is happening? Well, Roger used music in those ways. So I would vote for Beauty as the first one, and everything else in between.
Just a quick thought. It's so interesting that, because I often used to think that Roger was dodging the God question in some way, even in his books on God. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he was actually. There were certain specific questions he feared being asked and feared being expected to answer in theological terms. But actually, what you just described, Andrew, is exactly that whenever he was actually reaching out to try to describe God or the nature of belief, divinity, much more, it was music that he came to. And that isn't a dodge. It's because it is the best thing we've been left to try to give us a sense of that thing which otherwise we're stumbling towards.
Well, he really put himself in our shoes. We're living in an age of doubt, even among believers. There's this doubt. And he put himself in that position as a believer who doubts. Yes. And he allowed, rather than just taking the easy way out, saying that he's a believer, he's a member of the Anglican Church, and he plays organ on every Sunday at his local little church. No, he puts himself in our shoes, and there was just something very comforting about that. He's speaking to an age of doubters, of materialists, and still making the case for God to them. And I think that is a huge contribution that he made, because we need people who are able to stand at that line and pull people in.
by the way, I'd just add one other thing to that, which is that, I mean, the day we're speaking, the news has just been announced that Cambridge University is trying to once again maul its student music program. I don't know if you've seen this. No. They've decided they're going to go for the decolonization thing with composers. And apparently, among other things on the coursework now is the usual dead white males allegation against Mozart, and the accusation against Stravinsky that he was culturally appropriating.
Like all of them.
Like everyone, yes, otherwise known as listening. And but it's a reminder. It's actually a reminder again of this thing that if that's what the age is doing, reducing Mozart to his race, reducing Beethoven to the time he was living in, reducing Stravinsky to sort of musical theft, then of course people are going to want to go to the places where they sense there's a real well. If everything else is telling you to do this same boring thing, then I think that there's a natural inclination of people to move, anyone of any depth, to move away from that and to move towards the places they sense are the things thinking about the things they would like to think about themselves.
We will turn to questions from the audience in just a moment here. Before we do, I just want to ask very quickly, what are some sources of hope that you find that perhaps you yourself and the spirit of Roger Scruton would light upon as being sources of preserving beauty or extending beauty in a world which right now seems to be almost overwhelmed by ugliness?
I've seen a lot of signs that what people are feeling, people are able to correlate what they're feeling with what they want to do about it. And I think Roger has been an incredible resource for those people because people get his books and they say, yes, that's how I feel. He's describing what it is. We can certainly see it in the, around us where we see all these beautiful, for the first, looking at the city of Dresden, for example, that they've rebuilt their city center exactly as it was before it was bombed so tragically. This traditional architecture we're seeing. Just even developers are figuring, they're seeing that when they do these huge developments, when they use traditional architecture, traditional form planning the town, and so it's walkable. So there's this overlap with what the left used to champion, which is localism and walkability, and smaller scale, and cursing these giant buildings that are built to make you feel insignificant. And so those are, I see that the marketplace has this wisdom that it's exerting, that people are voting with their pocketbooks and with their feet, moving away from ugly places, moving to beautiful small towns. Certainly in classical music, the only thing that's saved classical music has been the audiences, because they would just, as soon as we play ugly music for them, they get up and leave. Or they'd either not buy tickets for it, or they would go excuse themselves, go to the bar, and wait till it was over. And so we've had this built-in policing going on, with the markets. Of course, when you have state-funded, opera houses and orchestras you do in Europe, there's no stopgap measure. There's no stopping them. And I've played in orchestras in Europe where we were playing something clearly nobody wanted to hear, and it would go on forever and it would be torture. But it was mandated by some administrator in some distant office saying you must play things like this. So I think society is turning a corner, at least part of the country. We're finally finding a way to describe, with the help of people like Roger, and certainly many people like ourselves who are, as we say, the progeny of Roger, who are trying to explain things in the same way that he did, that we can, without necessarily being reactionaries, we can certainly replicate what was wonderful, what we loved about life only a short time ago, learn from the past. And so I think that's, I'm seeing it, I'm feeling, and of course it's good, it's, there's strong forces trying to prevent that from happening, but things have happened in such a big way that it's unmistakable. And there's enough people who are saying, yeah, we can do this better, whatever that might be. Might be we see the charter schools exploding around the, around the world. Even my liberal sister and her husband took their kids out of their very progressive school and put them in Catholic school. And the kids are elated because they're learning things and they love nuns and and it's structure and it's just the kids are blossoming. So I'm very happy about, and to me that's the markets speaking that there's a response there.
Yes, I agree with that. I think we may be at the end of a wave of some of the things you describe. I remember the IRCAM in Paris, Pierre Boulez's institute, was famously underground sort of thing.
The bunker.
Roger, I remember saying it was as if it was a sort of laboratory.
Yeah.
In which, sort of terrible experiments were being carried out that were
community
then imposed
sciences
on the
and
public, yes, I think we might be at the end of that wave in that it's no longer compulsory to do that sort of thing. There are people who are all allowing themselves to return to tonalism in music, and don't regard tonality as being a dirty word. In architecture, again, and again, it's not a left-right thing, of course. And that was that very moving thing that Roger and his father, who was, of course, very left-wing, did find common cause on, which was the beauty of the built environment. This is not a left-wing or a right-wing thing. This is something that anyone of any political views or none can share, which is that people have a desire for home, and a home that's beautiful, a place that's beautiful, that is theirs. And that actually, as you say, Andrew, if you offer people the chance to live in more attractive housing, they do move towards it. Like if you offer them the choice with schools, they will go to schools where the students are going to be tested and more. So I do think that some kind of corner is being turned on that. I just say one other thing very quickly. I often used to, not always, but quite often in my books, I would go in early stages and I'd speak to Roger and I'd try to talk about some of the sort of tectonic themes, and this new book of mine, The War in the West, is the first that I haven't been able to do that with him. But actually, there was a sort of, I felt like there was a hint he gave me anyway, because I was thinking a lot about resentment, and ressentiment is a similar thing, but as Nietzsche and others would describe it, and that our age is one where resentment is very, very strong. It motivates so much politics on left and right. And I wanted to write about this, and I found a few sort of little signposts. One was in Dostoevsky, and I was reading him a couple of years ago, in that moment in The Brothers Karamazov, where Ivan meets the devil, not to give the plot away, but Ivan meets the devil, and the devil mentions in passing that gratitude is not an emotion that's been gifted to him to feel. And I thought, that's only Dostoevsky could just throw that away, But of course the devil can't feel gratitude, because if the devil felt gratitude, he wouldn't be the devil. Anyhow, and actually the last thing that Roger wrote was a diary for us at the Spectator in London about his last year. He mentioned some of the work I did to try to help him in that time, and the last thing he wrote pretty much was the last entry in the diary for that year was, he said, that come to the end of life, you start to understand what life is about, and he said what life is about is gratitude. And so I do think that's such an important thing, a thought to leave us with, that is what is so missing in our societies, particularly in the developed world, particularly in countries where we have so much, that there's no damn gratitude, All the thing of why I want one, and the great thing about this, of course, if I can just quickly say, is that this transcends all class issues, all socioeconomic, all racial issues. I think probably everybody knows or has met someone who has absolutely nothing in worldly terms, but is a person of gratitude, who is charitable towards others, expresses kindness in their lives and is grateful for what they've got. And equally, I think we probably all have at least met, and hopefully don't know, someone who is very comfortable by our standards and yet is a totally resentful person. So actually, this is something you can model in your life. You know, you don't have to go down the path of resentment, whatever the world has given you. There is this other path, which is to look around. I mean, look at all the things that are free today. Every young person with an iPhone has access to most music.
Most knowledge that has ever been known.
I mean, I was for the last generation of people. I had to save up my pocket money and go and buy the disc in order to hear what Beethoven's Sixth sounded like. You know, I had to find a library that could lend me the thing to find out what that. And now it's all there. Now, and we've sort of, with things like that, we've banked them in no seconds flat and moved on saying, well, why haven't we got other things we want? We don't spend any time thinking of the things we do have. And if we talk about a lovely building, any of us can just go to our phone and see it. Before, we'd have had to have been incredibly rich, travel very dangerous paths for days, and maybe not even get to see the thing. All of these things are there, and we can have an attitude of that is an attitude of gratitude.
Marvelous. Well, we have about 5 or 10 minutes for questions. We do have a microphone, I believe. Let's try to pass that around. We'll go to the gentleman in the back and then further to the front. And then over here, yes.
There you go.
Sounds good.
Back and then here and then to Lieutenant Governor Sears.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. My name is Paul Dugan-Law. I'm the president of the Palm Beach Freedom Institute. Happy to be here in Washington today. I have a comment and a question. Comments about hunting, which Douglas was talking about before. Its original publisher, St. Augustine Press, is in the process of reissuing.
They are good.
Yes. They told me, I know because I tried to buy the rights from them. But they're having supply issues, so it's delayed. But they are planning to reproduce this wonderful book. Question has to do with, since we're in the Brazilian embassy, this might be the only safe place in Washington to ask this question. Roger's relationship with Donald Trump. And I think if you follow that history, you'll remember his op-ed in the New York Times, sort of summer of 2018, where he disparaged Trump. He said that Trump was completely a creation of social media, that his conservatism was not authentic, and that actually he was a product of cultural decay, or words to that effect. And I remember getting very cross with Roger about that, and he gave me one of those answers that he would give leftists, like, well, if that's what you want to think. Right? It was one of those types of things. Did his attitude, we never talked about it again before he died, but did Roger's attitude change in the remaining period of his life to the best of your knowledge?
Well, you reminded me of something really funny that Roger said to me. At one point, Trump went to address the G7 and gave a very speech that's, that many of us remember. In one of the lines in this speech, he said he was trying to define the difference between Western civilization and not Western civilization. And in one of the lines, he said, "We write symphonies." Yeah. And in my world, everybody's heads exploded, and they couldn't. They were like,
it's a disaster for symphonists.
Exactly. Well, they were saying, yes, he's right. We do write symphony, but he can't say that. But I was having such a great laugh. Actually, in your home, Christina, it was we were talking about that. And he said, but the question is, does he listen to symphonies? Because he questioned that. So that was his most memorable commentary on Trump. But anyhow, it was that certainly sent shockwaves through my microcosm.
Andrew,
world.
since you once appeared in my class, you might be interested in Trump's comment on Wagner's Ring Cycle, which he said to the editor Tina Brown.
Sorry?
Trump talked about the
Trump
Wagner.
talked to Tina Brown about Wagner's Ring Cycle. This is what he said.
Okay.
Never again.
Yes,
He was an opera subscriber in New York. He saw The Ring of the Nibelung sometime in the 80s and told Tina Brown, I'll never sit through that. Just like, never again. That's like that.
Yeah, you can understand why Roger wasn't the greatest fan, perhaps, in that 2018.
Exactly.
I had a sense that his attitude might have changed because if you look at things that developed, particularly later in Trump's first term, the 1776 project, the directive that all federal architecture in the United States should follow classical forms, of disparaging cancel culture, disparaging critical race theory. These were all things that would have fit very easily with what
I think nevertheless, I mean, the job of a philosopher is partly not to get too involved in, candidate selection or so on. I mean, I mean, obviously Roger had views about all sorts of politicians, but I think it was unusual for him to have any sort of, I mean, he never endorsed people or sort of...
No.
He didn't have... And in fact, one of the oddities in the 1980s in Britain was that he'd published his book, The Meaning of Conservatism, and was by some people, therefore, hitched to the Thatcher wagon, but he wasn't a Thatcherite.
Not at all.
And yes, I mean, I think that... I think what people go to him for, and will go to him for in the future, is actually precisely that thing of not getting into sort of candidate selection or preferred people in the short term.
It's too ephemeral for him.
It's too ephemeral, exactly. I remember that reminds me of something. I remember the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks once said, we had a dinner for Roger and he's got his knighthood, and Jonathan Sacks had been one of the signatories. You have to get various people to sign letters to say the person should get an honor, and I got Jonathan Sacks, who'd been one of his former students. Tom Stoppard wrote a beautiful letter of support, and almost everyone who had been a prime minister in Eastern Europe, because of course they were all people who'd been students of his in the underground university. Mm-hmm. But I remember Rabbi Sacks saying at this dinner, he said Roger is bigger than our age, and I thought that was absolutely true. And therefore, of course there were things that would flow by.
Okay, here and then to the Lieutenant Governor afterwards.
Thank you, gentlemen. First, what an honor and a privilege to be here. And thank you to all of you for facing fearful odds, fighting for the ashes of our fathers and the temples of our gods, and thank you. In the vein of music, sort of a truncated form of desert island discs. If you were to be cast away and you could bring one disc, Douglas, you mentioned Beethoven's Sixth. I don't know if you'd change that, but if you could bring one disc yourselves, and if you could surmise what Roger Scruton might have brought to spend eternity on a desert island. That's my question. Thank you.
It's a tough one. Well, Douglas is a fellow musician, so I'm very happy to be talking music with you. So what would you listen to if you had only one disc? That's usually in my world we pose the question, which composer, but we don't. But one work. Gosh, that's a tough, because the way classical music works, it's like a big family of composers. It all is constantly referencing the other one.
I meant the question. Which composer would you spend?
Okay, I didn't mean to sidestep it, but it's. Does any work?
Well, I think Roger would have taken Wagner, wouldn't he? I mean, I think without a doubt, he'd have taken either Tristan or The Ring. If he was allowed all of it, he would have taken all of it.
Interesting.
I don't think I would take Wagner to the desert island. It depends what you want to get out of your desert island experience, doesn't it?
We need to be there for a lot longer if it's Wagner.
I mean, you would want to take something that repaid a lot of re-listening.
Yes, absolutely.
And probably something that reminded you of not being isolated. I don't know, actually. Funny enough, when we were all in isolation the other year, I went through all of the Bruckner symphonies because I hadn't really done that properly. I might take Bruckner 8, actually. Otherwise, I'd take something that would remind me of a world I was no longer in. I don't know, Rosenkavalier or something. And I suppose I could be on the desert island dancing alone to Rosenkavalier. There's a happy image.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yeah,
my pick, because I'm glad you were stalled for me. It's good, because now that I have to go on record, this is a tough one. Yeah, I mean, I'm a trumpet player, so Bruckner all the way. I mean, Bruckner 8 is one of the greatest, Bruckner 7, Bruckner 9. These are absolute. Yeah, you're standing before two Brucknerians, and Bruckner is the next big thing to happen in classical music when people really discover. He's really been, because but Bruckner was concentrated doses of Wagner. It's Wagner without all the talking.
Yeah.
And there's no way excuse me.
So what's the point?
Right. Well, it's
He's a slow burner, that's the thing.
Wagner straddles both theater and music, and I'll just take the music part, thankfully. But for me, there's an incredible disc that Bernstein's conducting of Beethoven's string quartets arranged for an entire string section, which is the Vienna Philharmonic, and that is one incredible CD that I just listen to over and over. It's so soothing, and it's maybe because there's no trumpets in it, but these are late string quartets of Beethoven, but the lushness of one of the greatest string section ever existed, and these are all string players who know Beethoven's chamber music intimately as chamber musicians themselves, and that I can hand that one off to you as my favorite, and that would give me comfort on a desert island.
Thank you, Jeff.
Good evening, gentlemen. Well, I would take Tchaikovsky, specifically the War of 1812.
A true patriot, aren't you?
And it might get heard and you'd be rescued.
I just wanted, before the question, I just observed that all three of you are wearing the same shoe. And that's how I know you're men. Because women would be upset if all three of us had the same shoe. But specifically, the question I have is education. And what you said about state-supported music that you had to sit through is awful. But because it was state-supported, nobody cared. Whether you listened to it or not, they were paid.
Well, there was no market feedback. There's nothing you can say. There's nothing you can do to prevent it.
And it almost killed it.
Well, certainly in this
market
they
is what saved it.
They're not. Yeah, they lack the market. When the arts come from above in a big system, it lacks the market sensitivity. Whereas what I love about the U.S. is we have all these private institutions that have to duke it out, to make the case every year for that their arts institution matters, and they can hold all the opinions they want, but their local public better like what they're offering. Otherwise, the support will dry up. So it's riskier because you can you can go out of business, but there's something so robust about the American system
that it preserves it. And
it actually does. At the end of the day, the good stuff is retained.
And that's what clicked for me just then, because I was thinking about education and public education specifically, and K through 12 in particular. The fact that parents, and even your sister you mentioned, as liberal as she is, she's no longer buying it.
Right.
The parents don't want to buy it anymore.
Right.
And yet it just seems to be getting worse. So what would Roger say would be the best way to convince parents to not listen to, or maybe he wouldn't, the elites who tell us, oh, no, public education is great, it's wonderful, swallow some more of this, while we send our children elsewhere?
Yes.
I don't know.
Well, that's a very, so much to do with what Andrew's describing, the sort of, as it were, the top end of the classical music world, is all downstream from the rot at the bottom, which is what isn't taught in schools. And I think one of the tragedies, I know Roger wrote about this as well, but one of the tragedies is that if you don't, for instance, introduce children to great music or great literature at school age, they've probably missed it for life. Not always. There are remarkable people who just find their own way, but broadly speaking, if you use what music lessons exist in schools to teach pop music, for instance, they're going to get that anyway, and you've deprived them of the opportunity to start early with ears that listen to great things, and musical literacy is thought to be so off-putting, but you know, if you can just explain to people the thing of delayed gratification, that everything that's good requires work, and that, you know, just as you need to learn to spell and read and write, you know, in musical terms, it's not just given to you any more than if you were just given a book as a child without being able to read and told to read it. I mean, but there's so little willingness to do the serious work needed for musical literacy in this country, or almost any country I can think of. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It becomes a rarefied art form, which is a disaster for everybody.
Well, I'm reminded again about Roger's little platoons that he cites from Edmund Burke, and that the solutions can be found in these much smaller groups. You know, the parents getting together just at the PTA level, saying what they want, just one school, rather than talking in this totalitarian terms about what should the entire country be studying. Can we just take things back to the lowest, or shall we say the smallest level, that might, you know, that so that things can be decided there. And I think Roger would really be excited about, you know, this advent of the charter schools, that these charter schools are not defined per se other than being charter schools, and that these curriculums can be rediscovered. I'd just like to say, isn't it amazing what we used to be able to do in one-room schoolhouses? My grandfather learned so much by age 15. You know, and the boys would go out and chop wood to keep the stove going in the winter, and it's just breathtaking without technology. And they didn't have libraries; they just had readers where they would just, you know. We talked about this last week, and that so much was accomplished with so little. Maybe minimalism or you know, being Luddites again in education would spark a revolution, because it wouldn't require huge amounts of money, because everyone says we have to spend more money on education. Well, maybe what if we spent way less? It might force out of us say, well, listen, we're going to have to just focus on the best ideas, the best, you know, writing the best chapters out of the best books, and figure out how to. And I think Roger would be on board with that, because he was certainly a minimalist in his life. He was certainly not a person who was extravagant in any way. To go to his home was not, even though he was a person who read many books, he had only the books that he really cherished on his shelves. It wasn't more books than, you know, the rest of us might have, but the way he read those books. And I think that's certainly what he would, you know, did with his children.
By the way, so one very quick thought, which is, it does seem to me absolutely crucial that the thing that's so often missing in music education is, if you don't give people the arc of what is happening, you make them strangers in this land forever. And what I mean by that is, I very often meet adults who just never had any musical teaching. And what you discover is that it's rather like when people, in the days when illiteracy was more common than it is now, and you would discover that somebody was illiterate and they were ashamed of it. I find that sometimes with people with music, that they know they don't know, and therefore they're fearful of going into it, that they might expose that they don't know any, you know, whether that Strauss or that, there are several Strausses, you know, what am I going, well, who came after who? Is Wagner before Bach or after?
Yeah.
And they're worried, and therefore they don't dare to go into it. And so one of the great things that you can do with musical education is just, even if without teaching people notation or anything like that, is to tell them what happened so that they understand the arc of it. And then they can go, maybe in the rest of their lives at various points, they can go in and find out. But not to be, you know, that's, and I've seen it so many times, that sort of fear of like, what's the classical period, you know, and then they get so lost and they become fearful of treading into it. And whole lifetimes, I think, of enjoyment are lost in this process. And you just have to teach them very simple historical story, you know.
Well, this conversation could last well into the next day, but I'm afraid we have reached time. We will, however, be adjourning to a reception, and I heartily encourage you to talk to both of our speakers. I'm very grateful both to Andrew Balio and to Douglas Murray for being here today, and of course to the Ambassador for hosting us here at the residence. Thank you.
Thank you.